This webinar is going to cover three topics. The first topic is the Christian worldview of suffering as the dark night of the soul. The second topic is the challenge of suffering. And the third topic is how do we walk with people through the dark night. The Christian understanding of suffering as la noche obscura del alma, the dark night of the soul, is quite distinct from the view of suffering that actually is we contemporarily actually have in our various cultures. And the first question we need to ask is, what is the Christian's understanding of suffering? And what I've come to appreciate is that Christianity has a very robust, a thorough, and a very nuanced understanding of the place that actually suffering actually has in human life, that does not negate, but actually affirms the goodness of God and the goodness of life and the goodness of the world that he has given us to live in. So I'm going to first get an understanding of what are the different causes of suffering and how it actually is more of a complex and a rich picture than we initially consider it to be. The first cause of suffering is simply that we live in a physical world with predictable natural laws, that if we stub our toe on a rock, it will hurt. If we fall over a cliff, we are going to get seriously injured, if not killed. And that pain and illness are simply biological facts that is just part of us living in a predictable world with natural laws where rocks are hard and gravity is going to cause us to fall down, and that those laws don't change just to keep us from actually getting hurt. It means that there is what we describe as natural evil, which is this neutral pain that actually that comes with part and parcel of being a biological person in a physical world. The Christian viewpoint in that is that it's not to be fatalistically accepted, but to be alleviated through care, medicine, and pursuing safety. So we have this nuanced viewpoint of, well, it's a natural, neutral fact. It's the price we pay for living in an orderly universe. And at the same time, it's right for us to actually take action, try to minimize the hurt and the suffering which people experience from tripping over our physical world. If divine absolute goodness excludes the possibility of pain and suffering, then actually the universe as an orderly physical universe would have to remain created. You cannot have an orderly universe without the possibility of pain and suffering. It just logically cannot happen. The second really brute fact of our creaturely existence is that we are mortal, and that death is simultaneously a brute fact of creaturely existence. All creatures die. And so there's an aspect where we have to accept our mortality as being part and parcel of the fact that we are created biological beings with bodies that age and have a use-by date. And yet at the same time, Christianity also has its viewpoint that death is also an enemy to be defeated. And so it's both a natural phenomenon to be accepted and an enemy to be defeated. There's an ambivalence and a nuance in the way that we view death. In the Old Testament, the viewpoint of death was actually that there was a life as a shade that we lived after death in a shadowy existence, which the Israelites called Sheol. And this was a view that was shared throughout all the cultures in the ancient Middle Eastern world, that after we die, there's a shadowy existence which we all end up falling into the afterlife, whether it's in Hades or the underworld, and that it is a fate that actually for every single person the wicked and the righteous alike. And what was really dramatic about the New Testament and the message of the gospel that Jesus brought was he said that actually, no, there's a resurrection of the body, that we are resurrected as bodily, glorious, immortal beings. And that death actually had two alternative fates. There was either the immortal life with Christ, or what the New Testament and the Jewish tradition described as the second death, the death of going into hell, a death of an existence apart from God. And the fear of death that actually people who do not have a confident belief in the resurrection of God is either there's oblivion, there's an end of my existence, which means that all life is pointless and meaningless, or else there's the fear of actually what might happen after death in terms of what my fate is. And one of the lovely things about the Christian belief that there is a life after death, and the life begins with an encounter with God, where there is an account for our life, that actually that gives our life meaning and purpose and significance, because God is the audience to the life that we live. And so the fact that actually God sees, God knows, and God recognizes the value of the life and the choice that we make after death means that actually gives life a significance and a hope and an ultimate destiny that actually death actually cannot rob us of. And that is the power of the Christian view of death, which actually no other worldview can actually match in the same way. Okay, so what we're talking about is that because we live in relationships with one another, and that a feature of our human existence is that we have a social dimension to our existence, because we're people in relationship with one another, that hurt unavoidably results from the twofold movement between love's call to intimacy and differentiated distance. We're continually negotiating how close and how far apart we are, and that we never sort of get that mix right. So we get hurt when we want more hurt or closeness from someone else that they're willing to give, and hurt is unavoidable in that mix. The other thing which makes hurt unavoidable is the fact that actually we are free, and that is the closer we come to other people and the more dependent we are upon other people, the more inevitable my freedom is going to conflict with your freedom. And so conflict between people who are two free people is unavoidable. And when you have conflict, there's going to be hurt and there's going to be pain. And sometimes long ongoing unresolved conflict can result in quite a bit of suffering. Interdependence, with our reliance upon one another and our freedom, means that actually my needs will not always be met by others. And so there's going to be hurt and frustration and pain simply because my needs are not being met. And when we have limited resources, then it's inevitable that there's going to be competition for limited resources, which actually makes conflict inevitable. And we see this playing out over and over again, where people who are powerful are able to get their needs met and what they want at the expense of other people who have less power. And so pain and suffering and misery is the result of the way that we actually exercise our freedom in interdependence with other people, in competing for resources when there's not enough to go around, or even when there is enough to go around, that some people hog it at the expense of others. So this is an inevitable source of distress, even before we bring sin into the picture. The other thing which is that actually love, which is central to being human, is also something which makes it absolutely inevitable that we'll experience pain. Brunner, who is a famous 20th century theologian, said that being for love is not one attribute of human existence among others, but it is human existence itself. Man is man to the exact extent to which he lives in love. So for us to love one another and to love others is just really profoundly written deep in us. And the dilemma is that actually loving inevitably involves pain. It's part of the package. As a person who loves, I experience pain when actually the love that I have is not returned, and also I experience pain when the person that I love themselves is hurt, so that my well-being and my happiness is hostage to the well-being and the happiness of the person I love. Often, when a person who I love is hurting, I feel it more than they do. Love is also, whenever love is transformative in its impact upon other people, it inevitably involves sacrifice. All of us who have raised children know the sacrificial aspect of love, and that sacrifice often involves uh, pain and suffering and effort and endurance. And so there's no such thing as love that actually is painless. That's right, of no value at all. The essential combination of pain with love we see in the experience of God, in that the God's divine love for us and for his world opens God up for pain. And he has experienced pain right through the ages, from the pain of the tragedy of Eden, through to the pain of that he's endured with Israel, with the struggles with adultery and idolatry, and Israel's faithlessness to God. The pain that God experiences even now with his engagement with us and with every human being in the world that he loves, means that actually God's commitment to actually love us has opened up God for just an amazing, endless, huge amount of pain. So pain is something which is integral to love. It's unavoidable. The big cause of pain and suffering in the world, of course, is sin. You might say that sin is the most destructive power in the universe. And it is our sinfulness which actually throws so many things out of whack, which actually causes unnecessary pain and suffering. Roy Baumeister, a very well-known social psychologist in the United States, wrote a book called Evil Inside Human Cruelty and Violence, where he examined the economics of evil. And the thing that he emphasized was that doing evil does not make economic sense. The gain that a person who commits a crime gets from the crime is nothing compared to the social and the emotional cost of the people that are the victims of the crime that person commits. For example, a man who rapes a woman, momentary pleasure of sense of power, but is nothing compared to the immense personal costs that the experience of being raped has upon the woman who is the victim of that. And so the economics of evil just do not make good economic sense. Roy Baumeister said that there are 4 reasons why people commit evil. First, it's an instrumental means to an end driven by lust, greed, or ambition. Second, it is egoism, where I'm insulted and my ego, my pride is insulted by someone. And so out of pride and ego, I'm going to retaliate and take revenge over the insult that actually you've given to me. Another cause of evil is religious or ideological fanaticism, And we have seen the evil that's brought about by Muslim fanaticism in the widespread problem of Islam terrorism, and Christianity also have had times when actually our religious fanaticism has caused great evil. And we can think of the Crusades or the wars of religion in the 16th century between the Protestants and the Catholics at the time of the Reformation. So Christianity is not innocent of this. It's whenever humans become fanatical about their beliefs or their ideals that we lose sight of the priority of importance of actually treating other people with kindness, decency, mercy, and respect, that evil happens. The other cause is that we do evil when we want to seek power and dominance over other people rather than to serve and to love. So sin actually plays itself out socially in so many different ways that just causes a huge overlay of pain and suffering and just economic and social and personal cost. So the question we have, you see, is that evil actually has all these different dimensions to it, and ranging from evil and pain, which is just simply unavoidable, to evil, which is absolutely intentional, inexcusable, and could be and should have been avoided. So how does God respond to this? The challenge we have is that we have this very strong belief that God is a God who's powerful, God is a God who is good, he is just, he is loving, and he is merciful. And God, being a totally good God, must be opposed to evil. It must be anathema to him. And sin is something which is horrific. So how does God respond? And often the challenge and the struggle we have is not so much when God does respond, but we struggle with God's self-restraint and the extent to which actually God lets evil play out in a way that seems to be far more tolerant than we could actually ever tolerate. And so how does God respond is a really important question. The first thing that's really consistent throughout the Bible from Genesis through to Revelation is that God responds out of mercy and forgiveness. One of the key things throughout the Old Testament, one of the key themes, is that Israel was confident that God was a forgiving God, almost to the point of being overconfident. And we see this example in Jonah, where Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh because Nineveh was the equivalent of the oppressive superpower that was, the Mongols of their time. And the reason why Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh but went off sailing in the opposite direction was because he knew that God was not going to judge Nineveh, that the game plan was that actually God was giving Nineveh an opportunity to repent and be saved. And Jonah hated Nineveh. So in Jonah 4:2, it says, "For I knew that you are a gracious and a compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity." I was just reading a passage with David where God gave David, three options, that he would flee from his enemies for 3 months. There would be famine over Israel, or there would be a plague and for 3 days. And David chose the plague because he said, God is merciful. He will not let the plague run its full course. And as you know, God did stop the plague. It didn't play it out fully. So there is this confidence in the graciousness and the mercy of God. We see this in a number of key instances. The first one was with Cain, where God said, you are going to be a homeless vagabond. And Cain said, I cannot bear this fate because, the people will raise their hands against me and they will kill me. And so God placed a sign on Cain as a sign of protection. What's really interesting with the fate of Cain was he ended up not having the fate of being a homeless vagabond. Far from it. He ended up being a ruler of a city. And so we see that there was a mercy that God had on Cain, which meant that the punishment that God said would happen, God relented on. And there was a blessing on Cain that actually happened instead. There's also the story of the forgiveness for David when he committed adultery and murder with Bathsheba. That God was very public in forgiving David his sin. But what's really interesting in those two cases with Cain and with David is that you have both forgiveness and also, but the forgiveness does not extend to a wiping out and negating of the consequences. The consequences of David's adultery with Bathsheba and murder of the Uriah the Hittite was that the sword would actually not leave his family. And so there was an intergenerational consequence that actually played out in David's line. The consequence for Cain was that he was uprooted from his homeland, and he was also separated from his family. And so the consequences of his murder flowed through. Now, what we find is the same thing with us within the ultimate with Christ, in that the mercy and forgiveness on the basis of the death of Christ on the cross is this mixture of the free giving of mercy and forgiveness, where God forgives us and he shows us mercy. And so we are restored into a relationship with God and we're freed from the guilt of sin. But often God does not unmake the consequences of our sin. They still play out. The wonder of God is he's able to work redemptively through the consequences of our sin to actually bring about wonderful outcomes in our lives and the lives of people around us. And so we have this mixture of the fact that God upholds the fact that human actions have significance and therefore there are consequences in the real physical world, which God does not overrule and negate. But the mercy and forgiveness which God gives us means that actually our sin does not define us ultimately, but God's redemptive action in able to bring good outcomes out of evil is actually what ultimately plays out in our life. And so in a very complex, comprehensive way, God's mercy and goodness triumphs over the impact of sin over and over again. The other way that God responds is through iniquity and consequences. God does have a settled determination that we will never get away with it. And one of the really common little lies of temptation that we've all experienced is, don't worry about it. There'll be no consequences. You'll get away with it. Nobody will find out. Consequences is summed up in the Hebrew word avon. And this word, which Cain says, my avon is too much for me, has a real nuanced meaning of both perversity, guilt, iniquity, and also the inevitability of judgment. And so it is a combination of the awareness that actually sin has had a consequence on me in terms of who I am as far as my own iniquity, that there's an interpersonal guilt, that I stand guilty before God and before other people, and there's an inevitability that there's going to be a consequence in the form of a punishment because I'm not going to get away with it. And sin and this divine order, if you like, that determines that actually we'll never get away with sin means that sin inevitably plays itself out. First, sin plays itself out in the life of the sinner, in that sin corrupts the sinner, leading to perversity and increased inclination to sin. And this is what Paul described in Romans 1, where he says that God gave them over to a dysfunctional mind full of all sorts of perversity and wickedness and evil and violence, and ultimately leading to a searing of the conscience where they no longer feel guilty about the sin which they do. And so there's a corruption of the sinner, which actually plays out. Sin leaves a legacy of guilt and iniquity, and often that legacy is intergenerational. In other words, the impact of the sins of the fathers do roll through into the generations of the family. And we've seen this in our counseling work, where you have people growing up in a violent home where the parents and other members of the family sin against them. That leaves a damage and an impact, which then actually complicates the way they're able to do their own families in their own subsequent generation. And so the impact of sin rolls through generations. Then on top of that, there is the doom and the inevitability of divine retribution. We know that there's a judgment coming. And we're looking forward to that on one hand, because the judgment of God affirms the justice of God and answers our cry for justice, which we all share, and particularly those who suffer. And yet at the same time, there's also something which actually we also have a sense of fear of. And the beauty of the forgiveness that we have through Christ is it frees us from the fear of God's judgment. We know we are forgiven. And so God's wrath and judgment is something which actually we know will not be against us. If anything, it is something which is for us. God's response to sin is wrath. And wrath is not just a future judgment, but also it's a present reality. And there's a way in which God actually is actively contesting with the impact of sin in our world, out of his determination that sinfulness will not stand, sinful humanity will not prosper. And as a result of God's wrath and his determination that this shall be the case, we see that actually sin plays out in our world over and over again in social disorder and corruption. That sin plays out when humans are given over to idols. And what's really interesting is that when a person moves into idolatry, that idolatry leads to a slavery to the idol, and also the character of the idol plays out in a form of sinfulness, which reflects the character of the idol that the person is committed to. So, for example, when a person makes money an idol, then it plays out in greed and doing all manner of evil in order to acquire more and more wealth and money. We also see that actually that God, when people sin and turn away from God, that there is an outworking where humans are given over to a disorder of sexuality. And we are certainly seeing this playing out in very dramatic fashion in every single all around us. And finally, that there is that God gives sinners over to a dysfunctional mind, leading to unrestrained wickedness. We lose our sense of morality, self-restraint, the love of integrity, and we become increasingly hardened and indifferent to sins which actually become normalized, and we what's the word? We can rationalize, justify, deny, excuse, ignore, because we do not want to have to stop. We want to be able to just enjoy the momentary pleasures which actually sin gives us. And so we lose our wisdom. And we have seen over and over again the people we work with that when they're committed to habitual sins, they lose their wisdom, they lose their clarity, they lose their ability to actually manage truth. And it can be really difficult for them to actually really get it. And what this does is that God is determined that actually humans will not prosper if we're sinful. And so the giving over to the consequences of sin is God shouting out to the world that actually something is wrong. Sin is destructive. Sin is painful. Sin causes suffering, which means it's a call for us to repent. The other thing which I'm also come to appreciate is that God's response to human sinfulness comes in the form of redemptive justice. Now, redemptive justice is concerned with the restoration and the reconciliation of the wrongdoer. One of the key themes throughout the whole Bible, from Genesis through to Revelation, is that God actually is on about being redemptive. He is a redemptive God. And God, in his own way, is able to bring redemption and justice together. Redemptive justice ensures that sin leads to pain and suffering to drive people to repentance. And when in order that actually the person who is the sinner might actually find redemption, mercy, forgiveness, and transformation. C.S. Lewis, in a really, really insightful book called The Problem of Pain, had this to say: sin is generally a masked evil that a person is not sensitive to as long as all is well, whereas pain is unmasked evil that is impossible to ignore. Everyone knows something is wrong when they are hurting. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Pain shatters the illusion that all is well, which means that actually when we see sin having really terrible, destructive impacts, and we say, why is God indifferent? Why is God not doing anything? What we're actually seeing is God doing something by forcing sin to its logical conclusion of evil, pain, and suffering, in order to make it abundantly clear how horribly evil and destructive sin is. It's a wake-up call. And it's calling us to really drive the message home that sin does not work. It is destructive to human life and well-being. And if we are to live well, it requires us to actually turn away from sin in all its forms. The last form of suffering is particular to Christians, and that is what we call the fellowship of Christ's suffering. And that is that a feature of the life of discipleship. Inevitably, at times, it involves us volunteering, entering into suffering as a consequence and as a result of us choosing to follow Jesus. And so all of us who are Christians have experienced suffering in this way. And we have embraced it, we have endured it, we have followed Jesus through it because of our commitment to be faithful to him and to be faithful to actually being true to who he calls us to be as his people. So the fellowship of Christ's suffering involves pressure, where we're pressure from our societies that do not share Christian values and the same the ethic, discrimination because we're Christians, stigma to the extremes of persecution, and ultimately martyrdom. Suffering also is involved in sacrificial outreach, ministry, and mission. Often outreach, ministry, and mission involves sacrifice, and sacrifice involves suffering and pain. There is suffering having to be not conform to the world, not to conform to our culture, but at certain points to really resist the pressures and the norms of our pagan secular culture. And we're all experiencing the pressure of having to not conform to and go along with what everyone else is doing at different points in time. There's suffering that's involved in the struggle against sin, the hard work of sanctification, and the relentless endurance and discipline that's required in pursuing holiness. And that spiritual formation, when it is really being fruitful, often involves travailing with pain. So there is this other dimension of suffering, which is part of the package of us being saints in a sinful world. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there because and just create some time for any questions with reference to that very brief overview of the multidimensional way in which the Christian worldview regards pain and suffering. And are there any questions that have come out of that?
So far, there has been no questions yet, John.
No questions yet?
I think
Okay.
Sarah.
All right. Let me go back to sharing. And what I'm going to do now is introduce you to the framework of the Dark Night of the Soul, which provides a really good viewpoint for just how we understand the place that actually suffering actually has, particularly in the life of the Christian. And where this is important is that often it is when people are actually going through a dark night of the soul are the times when people actually come to us for counseling. And so to be able to recognize when a person that we are working with or seeking to help is going through a dark night is going to inform us about what is the approach that actually we need to take here. St. John of the Cross regarded the dark night of the soul as times of profound personal growth that come out of suffering, and that these times make an essential contribution to human maturation and spiritual formation. Now, this is really important because there's a very widespread view that if I'm suffering and I'm going through a really painful time, it must be because I've done something wrong and God has disciplined me because actually I failed to be obedient or righteous, and that if I was a really obedient disciple, then actually I wouldn't suffer. And what I've come to really appreciate through St. John of the Cross's writings is that suffering is essential part of discipleship. In other words, if God takes you seriously as a disciple, you can guarantee he's going to take you into a dark night, because a dark night of the soul has a crucial and an essential contribution to our formation, spiritual formation as Christians. And indeed, it is what actually makes us fit for heaven. The dark night of the soul is a struggle which involves a pruning of the soul, which is a relinquishment of attachment to things of this world, some kind of loss, a cracking of belief systems, and a courageous stretching out for the new. This is the movement. And the dark night of the soul is a time of crisis where there is a genuine possibility that the soul may be crushed or crippled rather than to grow. And one of the things which I find really impressive about God is his willingness to take risks, willingness to actually throw people into crisis where there is this risk of possibility that actually the person may be crushed rather than actually growing through the experience. And sometimes when we're in a dark night, we feel as if we are being suffering beyond our ability to care, and we just do not know whether we're going to be able to come through it or not. And that often a dark night forces us to discover reserves of strength and endurance that actually we did not know we ever had. Now, St. John the Cross said that there were 4 nights of the four dark nights. That's in this diagram here. So let me explain the 4 different aspects of it, because again, it will help you to identify where the person coming to see you may be. There's a dark night of the senses, and there's a dark night of the spirit. The dark night of the senses, the focus is to, what's the word, prune or purge our souls from attachment to things of this world. Because we are physical, bodily people, we love physical things. We love we love one another, the sexual, sensual love of beauty, love of work, love of all the things that we enjoy, love of fellowship and fun and community. And so it means that actually that we have a lot of sensory gratification that we come to treasure and we come to love. And so a dark night, an active, there's active and there's passive. Active means that I'm voluntarily engaging in the dark night. Passive means that actually it's forced upon me. And usually it's the passive nights that actually bring people into distress. So the active dark night of the senses is when I decide to let go and forego sensory gratification, because I'm placing a higher priority on actually valuing and pursuing my relationship with God. And I think many of us have had experiences where God has said, you need to let go of that. You need to no longer pursue that. You need to no longer, pursue the climbing the corporate tree, pursuing jobs that actually involve more money, working hard, letting go of, if you have a real love of riding or walking in forests, whatever, that sometimes God says, I want you to actually lay down what you treasure, because actually it's getting in the way of your love for me. And when a person willingly lays those things down which are precious to them, that is painful, and there's suffering that's involved in that, but it is a decisive voluntary act. The active night of the spirit is when we pursue spiritual disciplines of self-denial. So these disciplines may involve, for example, fasting, or giving time for prayer and meditation at the expense of sleep, or choosing a very simple lifestyle, or doing a life of mission that involves sacrifice, and denying the pursuit of our own interests for the sake of bringing the gospel to others. That those relinquishments and pursuits of discipline can involve a letting go of what would be otherwise delightful and enjoyable, because of the priority that we are giving to responding to the call that actually God is laying upon us. The passive night of the senses is when events happen which actually force us to forego things. So, for example, a person who was an athlete may have a serious accident that leaves him a paraplegic, and it happened because this person's pursuit of being a champion was the thing he was completely devoted to, and he had no time for God at all, because this was what he was living for. So God brings that to a halt through this accident as a way of forcing that person to reassess their values and what's important, and to bring that person back to a valuing of God. And so things which actually become loves, which take on an idolatry or a central place in our life that should be occupied by God, God may intervene to actually force us to lose those things in order that we may turn and bring our love to God back into its central place. So that's a passive night of the senses. And as you can see, that can often involve quite painful losses and quite significant adjustment that a person actually has to struggle through and work through. The most darkest dark night of the soul is the passive night of the spirit. And that is when a person has really distressing, painful experiences that shatter one's hopes, shatter one's beliefs in God, shatters one's expectations, and confidence about God's goodness and love for me, because God allowed all of these things to happen. God never showed up. God never rescued me. God never healed me. God has been silent. And so there is a crisis of faith and belief and hope and despair when one's belief system collapses under the cascade of horrible things which actually happen. And those dark nights of the spirit, those are the times of most profound personal crisis. So you can see that the dark night of the soul actually has these different aspects and dimensions to it. And the ones which, as counselors, I think we're going to be engaging most with is with people who are in the passive side. The passive night of the senses, where loss and tragedy has forced detachment from things which were important and precious to them, or the dark passive night of the spirit, where a person actually has a crisis of faith.
Yeah, there are lots of questions now, John.
Okay.
Are you ready to take them on?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the first question is, if pain is unavoidable with love, will there be pain in heaven?
Oh, that one I don't have an answer to. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And maybe, we're speculating here, but I don't know, because I have no idea what heaven's going to be like. So I don't know the answer to that.
I don't think anyone of
But
us
it does
knows.
open up the possibility, doesn't it? And maybe it opens up the possibility that actually pain actually is not a bad thing. And you see, the interesting thing about pain in love is it actually gives us a sensitivity to ensure that actually we don't cause the loved one pain. So pain actually serves as a boundary to actually help us love one another well. And so in that respect, it is quite possible that actually pain will actually be in the mix in heaven, but it'll be one that's a signal, right? Rather than something which we suffer, because we can correct it and address it. Where suffering is when pain is persistent and we cannot actually address and correct it. Yep.
Okay, next question. Is there a modern day equivalent of the tree of good and evil?
I'm going to say no. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the only way there's going to be an equivalent is if you actually make an understanding about actually what you want the tree of good and evil to symbolize. And if you want to use it as a symbol, right, that points to an equivalent, then you can actually use it as a symbol in that way. And that's that's fine. But what we're doing is we're using it as a symbol.
Right. Okay, good answer. Okay, if someone has great sin and repents, mental pain may remain. For example, somebody who has an abortion and then repent, but then carries with her sorrow. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that you know how we talked about consequences, and that often because of the continuity of our life story, and that we take our history with us, that we are going to wear emotional scars from the things we've experienced. You know, just like Jesus, you know, in his resurrected body had scars on his hand or on his side, which we see. What we don't see are the scars, the emotional scars, which Jesus actually bears with him in his resurrection, but they are there. And so the interesting thing about a scar is it's a testimony to a wound which has been healed. And so when we carry a scar from something we've been forgiven from, it's a testimony to the wrongness of what we did, and it's also a testimony to our recovery from that. And so I think we will carry our scars with us.
And sometimes those scars may not necessarily be a bad thing too, right?
Sorry?
And sometimes those scars that serve to remind us these things are not necessarily a bad thing either.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, let's go on to the next question. Can you comment on the dynamic of suffering versus healing? God seems to allow suffering. He also seems to heal and remove pain. What about Jeremiah 29, verse 11? Plans I have for you are to prosper you and not to harm you.
Well, I think that you have both, don't you? And I think part of it is what are the purposes of which actually God is pursuing. And as we see that through the dark night framework, that God actually uses suffering to bring about his purposes of change and formation. He also uses suffering to actually bring home the message of the evilness of sin. So there are purposes which God's pursuing through suffering, just as there are purposes which God pursues when he does healing, because healing is not only an act of mercy to the person who needs healing, but also it's a sign of the resurrection of Jesus. To both to the person who receives healing and also to the person who receives healing to those who actually witness it. And so both healing and suffering actually serve different purposes of God.
Okay. I want to try to get to as many questions as we can.
Yep.
The next one, is there a biblical basis for the idea that to be greatly used by God, one first needs to be greatly broken by God?
I'm not aware of a biblical basis for that. I think that what I will say is that what I've said before is that an integral part of the discipleship journey is that God will bring us through dark nights. They're crucial to our formation. Now, the form and the extent of the dark night is going to vary from person to person. And there's not a pattern to that, but we all face that.
Okay, thanks, John. Okay, one more question. Is pain inevitable for Christians or the result of our lack of faith? If our clients think that they should not suffer because God should stop that, how do we as counselors deal with this? Theology or counseling?
Did Jesus lack faith? How much pain did he experience? The pain goes through the territory. It's not. It does not correspond to lack of faith at all. It goes to the territory. If anything, I think that actually a person who is really, really faithful, if we're talking about sharing the sufferings of Christ, a person who's really faithful is going to actually expose themselves to pain by virtue of their faithfulness.
There is so much wisdom in what you're saying, John. I'm taking so much time to kind of really digest the wisdom that you in your words. I'm going to go to the next question. A wise brother comments in Revelation 21, verses 1 to 4, mentions there will be no more tears, pain, suffering in heaven.
Isn't that a lovely prospect?
Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk on before we go on to the maybe next set of questions, John?
We might just go on to the next topic.
Okay.
I'll go back to screen share. Hold on. I think there we go. Okay. All right. Okay. So the challenge of suffering, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is a famous quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century philosopher. Suffering raises the questions, why? Why is concerned with meaning, and it seeks meaning in a cause. What's interesting is that God he does not answer this question in terms of why. God never gave an explanation to Job for what he went through. And in Luke 13, when the disciples asked, why did who sinned that this tower fell upon these people? And Jesus did not answer the question in terms of a cause. He just simply said, unless you repent, you will likewise perish. And so he brings the responsibility back to our action and our response. In John 9, the famous story where a man who is born blind, and they asked, who sinned, this man or his parents? Jesus actually answered the why question by actually healing the man and giving him his sight. And so that the meaning of the man's blindness was actually found in the outcome of the way that actually Jesus met that person and gave him and restored his sight. So the question of why actually is not the key question. And what it points to is that the meaning of suffering sometimes does not lie in the cause, but actually we find the meaning of suffering in the outcome. An example is the cross of Jesus. The meaning of the cross for us does not lie in the cause that actually he was lynched. It lies in the outcome that actually he was subsequently raised from the dead. And so we actually have forgiveness and life in his name. Suffering tests us. It throws a real fundamental question to us as to what road we would choose. How shall we respond to suffering? What course of action shall we take? Shall we walk through it, or shall we run away? Shall we protest, or shall we accept? Shall we deny and minimize it, or shall we tackle it? Shall we give in, or shall we give in? Shall I become a victim and do victim? Or shall I become a survivor? Or over that, shall I become a hero? In other words, suffering, the significance of suffering is the question it poses to every single person as to how they will respond and what they will do. And it's our response that actually is the key thing, which is going to determine the impact of suffering and ultimately its meaning. Suffering and hardship evokes faith like nothing else does. Hardship and disaster commonly encourage people to turn to God. There is a positive relationship between hardship and belief in God, and a negative relationship between country, wealth, faith, and meaning in life. And there have been a number of sociology research studies that actually have found this, that the richer a country is and the more well off it is, the less belief in God there is in that country. And so there is this thing that actually faith becomes strong when life is tough. And what I've come to really appreciate is Christianity is it's such a wonderful resource in that the faith which actually Christ gives us is a faith that actually is really designed for hardship, because it comes into its own like nothing else does when we're experiencing hardship, and it gives meaning and courage and hope. So Christian faith is for hard times. It's a resource for hard times, which means that when we're living in a life of plenty and ease and comfort, those conditions don't give us the opportunity to exercise and develop and maintain actively the faith we have. We become comfortable and slack, and so our faith becomes lacquered and weak. But hardship brings on faith like nothing else does, which is an interesting aspect in terms of the place that actually pain and suffering actually has in Christian and human life. Suffering tests belief systems. Fiona Walsh, who is a very well-known American marriage and family therapist who is not a Christian, had a great appreciation for the value that faith and spirituality gave the clients that she worked with, resources to be able to manage suffering and hardship that were unique. And she made this observation that in the midst of suffering, as we dig deeply within ourselves and reach out to others, the hardship endured open ways for the spirit to grow. In turn, spiritual beliefs and practice strengthen the ability to withstand and transcend adversity. Such keys to resilience as meaning-making, hope, courage, perseverance, and connectedness are all enhanced by spirituality. Now, what she recognizes here is really important for counseling, that actually it's the resources and the depth of the resources of spirituality is what actually enables people to actually grow and endure and respond well and stand up to the challenge of hardship and suffering. And therefore, counseling has to, an integral part of counseling is working with a person's spirituality, regardless of what faith that person has. That is our task to help them to find the resources, the personal resources they have in their faith, and use it to actually strengthen them for being able to walk through and respond well to the suffering they're facing, so that they actually bring through it in a way that it bears fruit in their lives. Suffering which does not fit the meaning system is going to provoke a crisis of faith and meaning. So, for example, one of the questions was, well, if I have faith, then I wouldn't suffer. That's a meaning system. So you can understand that if a person believes they're exercising a lot of faith and then a lot of suffering comes in, it's going to bring that meaning system into crisis, because they say, well, if I'm suffering, I must not have enough faith. And if I have enough faith, that's going to magnify the belief of the person, and also believe that their suffering is them, a spiritual failure. And so the belief system, the suffering, unprovoked suffering, that person there is going to bring that simplistic belief system into crisis. The meaninglessness of suffering often shows up in inadequate belief systems. The crisis that Job faced, and also Job's community faced, was that the calamities that befell Job and his family did not fit the meaning system that God prospers those who honor and are really faithful to him and who are upright and righteous. And so there was a crisis of the meaning system. And Job and his wife responded to that in two different ways. Job said, curse God and die, which is loss of meaning system and actually falling into despair of meaninglessness, or trust and acceptance. And so God says, I'm going to believe in God. I'm going to trust God, even though all of the circumstances of my life at the moment contradict everything that actually I'm hoping for. And so he chose the road of trusting and acceptance, trusting God and accepting what's happened in a place where actually it did not make sense. And that pushed him much deeper into God, and he had to create a new meaning system as a result of that. The other thing that's commonly experienced in suffering is the silence of God's presence. And John at the cross expressed this desolation of when we feel that actually God is absent, God doesn't respond, God has gone. When in this poem, the spiritual canticle, which I'll just simply read out to you. Where have you hidden away, gone from me, dearest, and left me desolate? Struck me and wouldn't stay, but rushed like a stag in flight when I ran forth imploring you out of sight. You shepherds, you that rove up in the branches on the mountain's brow, if you should meet my love, my one love, tell him how I'm heartsick, fevered, and fast sinking now. So during these times, we experience the silence of God's absent presence, because the spiritual formation of this experience requires the experience of walking alone. It is necessarily a solitary journey. But God's silence is not abandonment, though it may feel like it. It is a necessary silent presence. In other words, when we feel God is not with us, God is gone, God's absent, God has absconded, that is not because he is no longer there or doesn't exist or he has abandoned us. It is because he's being deliberately silent. And the peril of those experiences of being alone in the place of God's absent presence is that we can interpret this absence as abandonment, and out of forsakenness turn away from God. The thing that we need to know is that when we're in these times of absence of God, when we actually have to walk alone, that walking alone is an essential part of discipleship, because it's when we are tested that I will continue to follow Jesus without the encouragement of God's presence taking me and accompanying me. And at that point, I'm choosing to follow out of my sheer, dogged, loyal commitment to follow Jesus, even if it means actually following him alone by myself. In those times when we actually have to follow alone in God's absence, the reality is that heaven's care for us is unchanged. If indeed it were possible, it's even more solicitous in this hour of peril. And it's not that nobody is there to help, but that God does not dare to appear to help because of the necessity of the experience of walking alone and what that is going to form in us, what it's going to prove, and what it's going to test. There are times when to follow Christ means to walk alone. And what we learn from this experience is essential in becoming a radical disciple of Christ, where I've made the decision, I will follow Christ no matter what. There comes a time in every disciple's life when we face an essential test of discipleship, that of walking alone, following Christ. Just as a child has to learn to walk alone without his mother holding his hand, a disciple learns obedience through suffering, through the pain of not my will, but your will, and the solitude of walking alone. Christ himself had to learn obedience, and the means by which Christ learned obedience was through suffering. Suffering itself is, from a human point of view, the first danger, but the second danger, which is still more terrible, is that we should not learn obedience. Those were quotes from Soren Kierkegaard, The Gospel of Sufferings. And Soren Kierkegaard was a Dutch philosopher and theologian in the 19th century. Okay, now just going to pause here for questions. The key point in this topic is it's not what we suffer that matters, it's how we respond to it. And that means that actually when we're counseling clients, the focus of our client is how the person responds to the suffering of the situation that they are in. That is the key here. Okay, any questions?
Yes, John, there is one question that I thought I would kind of put it in front first, even though it came a bit later.
Yep.
In the context of the crisis of faith that you talked about earlier, the question was, humans seem to have been made far more robust than we might think. We're made to seek to walk together with God, and suffering can edge them closer to God. How then should we walk with suffering clients? How could we have walked well, just like Job?
Topic 3.
Okay, so we will hang on to that question.
That's right.
All right. Then I'll go back to the previous question. One of our participants asked, will one experience all 4 nights of the soul, or not necessarily all 4?
I think there's no necessity, because every person's journey with God is unique. You know, we each have our own journey. And that means that that journey may involve we going through all 4 nights, or it may not. Right? It depends on actually what's appropriate in terms of God's work with us in our formation, in our journey with Him, and also what actually happens in terms of the circumstances that actually we face. But you'll get one.
Okay, same in the same topic of dark night of the soul. Is the dark night at times more evidence of the feeling that God is distant that goes with depression?
Yes. I think the depression is a very common emotional experience in a dark night, and that when a person is in the passive night, whether it's a passive night of the senses or the passive night of the spirit, then often the experience of God's absence is involved in that, because it actually it deepens the crisis. There are other times when actually we go through a dark night when we actually have the comfort of God being with us in a very strong way. It varies.
Okay, one last question before you go on to your topic 3. How about the balance of pain received from abusing parents? Where is the place for forgiveness in this?
That is a complicated question. I will put it this way. The important thing about forgiveness, when we forgive someone who has sinned against us and has had a huge negative impact, is that forgiveness, sometimes we forgive the person not for their sake, but for ours. Because the work of forgiveness actually frees me from the person, and it also frees me from what happened and enables me to move on. And so forgiveness is often an important element in the healing journey. What we need to be really clear is that forgiveness does not necessarily require reconciliation. Those are 2 separate things. And when you have an abusive relationship, and where the abuser is not coming to the party in terms of repentance and really owning up to, what he's done in a way that gives you confidence that he's changing his mind, his ways, and it will not continue, then reconciliation, any attempt at reconciliation, going back into that relationship is an act of stupidity. So there are times when we forgive, but when the forgiveness is a violation of the relationship itself, we also may choose to say, I'm not entering back into that relationship. It is damaged beyond repair. It doesn't negate my act of forgiveness. It's more about the possibility of reconciliation. Yeah.
Okay, on to topic 3 then, John.
Yeah, okay, topic 3. All right, so this topic is about how do we as counselors walk with people when they're going through a dark night. This is where it gets practical, and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to put these things out really, really quickly as nutshells, and as info bits or just kernels of ideas that you can actually work on developing. The first thing that's really important is that when walking with someone in a dark night of the soul, the task of a Christian counselor is not to do therapy, but like the Spirit, to be a paraclete. That is, someone who comes alongside to encourage and to help. In other words, we are to be a soul companion on the journey with the person who's going through a dark night. Now, this is important because a dark night, if God places the person into a dark night, it is a night of formation. And therefore, you don't want to do therapy if it involves trying to get yourself out of the dark night. The person needs to go through it and let the dark night bring about its outcome in terms of what God wants to bring forth in that person. So the key is that we need to be a spiritual companion. And St. John of the Cross, in the living frame of love, says that actually we are to be a spiritual companion with people going through a dark night in a number of different ways. The first one, and this is most important, we are to be Emmanuel. That is to provide a compassionate presence that simply says to the other person, you're not alone, you're not abandoned, I am with you. And that sense of being Emmanuel to a person protects the person from the peril of concluding that actually God has abandoned him or her. So we're able to bring a compassionate presence on behalf of God where God is in a place of absent presence because he dare not be too present. Sacred respect. This is where we need to be reflective and to sit and help a person reflect and understanding what their experience is rather than to be too prescriptive. We're not doing therapy. We're sitting and we're helping a person reflect on what their experience is, because that is what the essential journey of traveling through a dark night requires. A crisis of faith is a positive sign because it's a sign that says, it's like the analogy of that when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, it goes into a chrysalis and the chrysalis has to break, or the cocoon has to break in order for the butterfly to break free. That there are times when our our belief systems are too small, they're too immature, they have to break in order for us to develop a deeper, richer faith. So a crisis of faith actually is a positive sign of a person's yearning for God. And so the way of sitting with a person in a crisis of faith is to help them get in touch with the God that they yearn for and that they long for, and they wish that God was there. And that the yearning is going to help them move through the crisis towards a positive outcome. It's really important to be really carefully non-directive, but to leave a person to make his own decisions, make his own choices, wrestle with his own struggles and questions, and come to his or her own insights. Now, St. John of the Cross was actually speaking to people who were working as spiritual directors in this book, but these same principles actually equally apply to us as counselors. Instilling hope by envisaging. One of the things that can be really helpful is to do future-focused questions. Supposing that you have successfully gotten through this crisis and looking back, you handled it really, really well, what would that have looked like? What would handling this really well look like? What course of action would you really take? What's really significant is how powerful hope is. When I was in Cambodia at the killing fields, there was a tape of a person who actually went through that whole process of being in forced labor camps. And when he was going into the labor camp in the mountain, his mother shared with him a dream where he said, I see you sitting, lounging in a hammock between mountain peaks. And the meaning of the dream was, you're going to pass through the mountains, you will survive the mountains, you'll arrive at a place where actually you are at ease and in plenty. You'll get through it. And that dream gave him a hopeful, confident expectation that he would survive, and that enabled him to not lose hope in the midst of the labor camps that he was in. Hope is a very powerful thing. Loss and sadness, a call to grieve. Grief is a response to loss, and it requires doing grief work. It requires doing mourning. It requires relocating what is lost with acceptance and gratitude, and then moving on. People sometimes want to move on and they avoid sitting with and going through the path of grief. And we need to be not afraid to actually sit alongside someone as they grieve and realize that actually grieving is a really important thing. It's a way of us emotionally processing the loss of people or things which are of highly value and important to us. And so it honors their significance. And so we shouldn't bypass it. If we try to bypass grief, it will end up actually, the person will end up getting stuck, and that grief will end up actually playing itself out in indirect and unhelpful ways. Depression. Depression sometimes I've discovered is a call to action. Depression is grief. And sometimes when a person is experiencing grief, it's grief and the person has to do grief work. Other times, depression can be a messenger that something is not right and must change. And we need to actually identify the call for action. For example, it is really common for people who are sinning, whether they are committing adultery, whether they're committing sexual sin, whether they actually have some sort of addictive habit that they are in, that the depression is a persistent wake-up call to the person that what you're doing is wrong. You need to change. This is not right. And so it's a place where God is saying, you're not going to get away with this. You're not going to be happy. And so depression, right, is the shouting that actually repentance is required. And so often, rather than just simply, we need to ask, what is the person depressed about? And is what the person depressed about of signaling that there's something that the person needs to do to change? The dilemma with depression is that it can be both a messenger that says something must change, and also it's a saboteur and it's a demotivator. And that's because depression actually brings in this sense of helplessness and hopelessness and grief. And the action tendency of grief is to withdraw, shut down, and be still and not take action, not do things. And that's because grief needs to still and contemplate and process the loss, you see. But so depression is complicated. But the point I'm getting at is If it's pointing to something which is not right and must change, like, for example, you need to let go of this in the dark night of the senses, then you draw out what the message is. Anger. Often people in a dark night are going to be experiencing anger, and anger is a very activating emotion. What's really interesting in the Bible is that God is frequently regarded as being angry. One of the things which I have found is really fascinating is that anger is a witness to truth. This is particularly the case when a person has, as a childhood, they've had grown up in a family where there's abuse and neglect, and the parents didn't love them, and as a result, the child ended up feeling worthless, unimportant, having no value at all. But there's this background, little persistent, angry protest that says the way my parents are treating me just simply wasn't right. And that anger that is concerned with justice and fairness, with how I'm being unfairly treated, and it's often concerned with my rights and my boundaries, and it's going to push back. But what's really interesting is that it's very truthful in what it identifies as not fair or not wrong. It's truthful in what it identifies as being not fair or wrong. So it's really sensitive to truth, which means it's going to call sin, sin. But the other thing is that anger also has a deep sense of, I deserve better. I have a right to be loved. I'm a valuable person. I'm worthwhile. I've got significance. And so the anger, when someone treats a person that negates that, is the place where the person is bearing witness not only to that what the other person is doing is wrong, but often it's also bearing witness to my worth and value as a person. And so anger often is truthful in that respect, even though its action of just simply doing aggression is really problematic, right? If you can get past that to identify what is it that anger is getting at, you can often help a person to arrive at truth. Shame. I'm talking only a particular form of shame here, but it's one that's worthwhile paying attention to. And that sometimes shame that is rightly directed to oneself in the form of self-criticism, self-rejection, and self-hatred is actually pointing to the fact that what I am doing is falling far short of who I ought to be. I'm not being the person I should be. I'm not doing the things I should be doing. I'm actually behaving in a way that is really shameful and disgraceful. And so it's a call and accountability to actually act in an honorable and an appropriate way. And so shame is this place of accountability, personal accountability to other people in terms of the expectations that people have in terms of my appropriate behavior. It's accountability to God in terms of what I know God's expecting me to be. And it's also my accountability to myself in terms of, am I actually really being the best person I can be? And so sometimes you can actually use shame to actually help a person to identify where they are really falling short of how they should be. And therefore, that point of self-criticism actually contains a call to change, to actually break through to pride and to self-respect, because I'm proud of actually what I'm doing. I'm proud of what I handled this. I'm proud of the way that actually I acted, which comes back to that future-focused question. A year from now, if you look back on how you handled this and you felt really proud of how you handled it, what would that course of action be? Fear is a call to courage. We all experience fear and anxiety when we feel threatened. Fear and anxiety are emotional threat detection systems. They are 100% negative. They're always about focus on what we're afraid of will happen, what we want to avoid, threats that threaten our well-being, our social well-being, our getting our needs met. And so fear and anxiety are God's created emotional safety systems. The thing is that when we are afraid and we are afraid that actually we will not make it. We're afraid that God has abandoned us. We are afraid of despair and hopelessness. And when we're in a place that requires relentless suffering and hardship and this fear and anxiety that's really, really strong, then the person actually needs to draw upon courage. And that often what we need to do in walking with people through a dark night is to help them to identify their sense of courage, and to actually put courage in the driver's seat. That is out of courage I'm going to act here, and to be strong and to be courageous in facing the overwhelming challenges that actually I'm facing in the dark night that I'm in. And so sometimes it's not sympathy that a person needs, or that must be how bad all that is. That sometimes we actually need to try to encourage them to actually take hold of their courage and to be strong and to be courageous and to persist in actually walking through it. Resurrection. The ultimate thing we have is the hope of the resurrection, which gives us a hope which even death cannot rob us of. One of the real perils of the dark night of the soul is that it presents a horizon of hopelessness, whereas the resurrection of Jesus gives us a certainty that the love of God, not death, has the last defining word over our lives. And that even often in a dark night, and particularly when we are depressed, there is no sign of hope. It's just darkness. We do not see any way out. We do not see any light at the end of the tunnel. And that is when we are really tempted to fall into despair. The glory of the resurrection of Jesus is that the resurrection of Jesus gives us a certainty of something to hope for, even past the dark, bleak horizon of death. And if we do not see anything to hope for, it is not that there's nothing there and that we're really hopeless, but rather it is that actually if what we hope for is simply out of sight, it has not yet come over the horizon, but because what we hope for has not come over the horizon into view, it does not mean it's not there in the future waiting for us. Okay, so those are some of the ways in which we can walk alongside people who are going through a dark night by actually, and it has to do with giving them courage to walk and to persevere and to actually not give up hope, but to believe that actually there is a future ahead of them that they will be able to come through and enter into. Okay, are there any questions?
Yes, one last question, John.
Yeah.
Okay. In walking with people in dark nights, they sometimes walk away from God forever. Even
Yes.
as Christians, we can feel disappointed by this. Any
Yeah.
suggestions or comments?
It's a tragedy. And see, I think that this is where the dark night is a real crisis where a person is tested, and that God actually takes a risk here. And the risk is, will a person actually give into despair and turn away from God? Or will a person dig in and turn towards God? That is the crucial question. And it would not be a genuine question if there was not the genuine possibility and risk that a person may give in and commit suicide and give in to despair and turn away from God. Right? That's the peril, and that's the tragedy of it. And I think that the only thing I can say is if a person does that, there's a tragedy, but it may not be final. And so you still walk with him, you still pray, you still wait for the person to come back. I mean, people do come back to the Lord after years from a tragic turning away from God in a dark night. It's not the end of the story. So it is. We do not despair. I was recently just sharing with a client just last week, whose father had some really bad experiences as a young man, and so he turned away from God, and he spent most of his adult life being really, really angry about God. I don't believe in God. God let me down. And he prayed for him, and when his father was dying, in the last weeks before he died, he actually made his peace with God, received Jesus, and he's now in heaven. So it happens, right? We don't give up on people when actually they choose to go that road, because God doesn't, and that road's not the final road.
Thank you so much, John. Okay, there are no more actually questions, but I just have a few more few other announcements for everyone. Just to remind you guys that Dr. John Andersen will be speaking again at the next ACCA conference on Monday night. Yeah, so please register through the ACCA or PACC website. I think most of you will have that. Or I can also just put it in the chat here, if you give me a minute. But I will put it in just a minute. Let me just finish with all the announcements, okay? And for those of you who desire the recording of tonight's webinar, we are happy to tell you that the link will be sent to those who have registered for tonight's webinar. And along with it will also be a set of the slides that has been shown, right? Okay, and with that, we have come to an end.